Hello, and welcome to Justice Speaks. I am David Wallace, a Chief Assistant Prosecutor in Michigan in the United States, and I'm co-president of the Justice Speakers Institute. We are continuing with our approach of interviewing justice leaders to get their perspective on current issues about the justice system and the rule of law, and where they think it should be going. Some of these leaders you may know or have heard of, and some you haven't. But all of them, whether educators, practitioners, or observers, will give you, the listeners, a better understanding of what the issues are and what is being done to make this world a better place. And with that, I'm excited to introduce my guest to today's episode, Ms. Elizabeth Anderson. And I've already ruined your name there, Ms. Anderson. I apologize for that. She is the Executive Director of the World Justice Project. Ms. Anderson, thank you for joining me on Justice Speaks.
David, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and you can call me Betsy.
Well, very good, Betsy. Thank you. And so first, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I grew up in Michigan, as it happens, in Muskegon, Michigan, and I'm a lawyer by training. And pretty early on in my career, I got bitten by the international law bug. I had the great opportunity to work as a legal assistant to one of the judges in the first early days of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And that was a fascinating experience. And I learned about the power of international law and international institutions to solve really intractable problems that emerge from conflict. And I also got exposure there in through that experience to what happens when you don't have the rule of law. And really, at that point, set a course for my career to work on in various ways to strengthen respect for human rights and rule of law.
So as we said at the beginning here, that you're the Executive Director for the World Justice Project. What does that mean? What do you do?
Sure. The World Justice Project is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C., with offices in Seattle, in Mexico City, and Singapore. And we work around the world in 140 plus countries to advance the rule of law, including here in the United States. And we do that in a variety of ways. Our mission is to create knowledge, build awareness, and stimulate action to strengthen the rule of law. And the knowledge piece is really about supporting scholars in a research consortium, scholars who are thinking about what is the rule of law, what difference does it make in major universities all over the world. We also gather a lot of data, and our rule of law index is what we are probably most well known for. It is an annual survey-based measure of the rule of law covering now 140 countries.
Wow.
In a consistent way, so we can make comparisons and see how we're doing compared to other countries, where the strengths and weaknesses are, where we have room to improve, and what's working in terms of reforms that people are implementing.
Wow. Well, and you've used the phrase now several times, and we've talked about the rule of law. What is that? What do we mean by the rule of law?
Well, that is a super an important question. And in fact, it is part of what motivated the creation of the World Justice Project in the first instance.
Okay.
It was started as a project of the American Bar Association, a guy by the name of Bill Newcomb, who had been the chief legal officer of Microsoft Corporation for almost 25 years, and had, through that work, experienced both the rule of law and lack of rule of law and how it affected a business like that, working all over the world. He was president of the American Bar Association in 2007.
Okay.
And he, as his presidential initiative at the ABA, set out to achieve two things. One, to see if we could develop a definition for the rule of law that would be globally resonant and in many different legal traditions and cultures, and really stand up to that kind of scrutiny. And then second, if we could measure it. And so that project really spawned the World Justice Project. After Bill's year as a president of the ABA, we spun it off as an independent NGO. and it's been doing this work ever since. So the definition that we developed back in those early days is really a 4-part definition.
Okay.
But there's an important preamble. So the definition is that it's a durable system of laws, institutions, norms, and community commitment that delivers on 4 different principles. Number 1, accountability of both private and public actors under the law. 2, that the laws are just, they're clear, publicized, stable, applied evenly, and that they respect basic human rights. 3rd, that there is open government, that the processes by which the law is adopted, administered, adjudicated, enforced, they're accessible, they're fair, and they're efficient. And finally, that there is accessible and impartial justice.
Sure.
So that when there's conflict, you can get justice in a timely way by a competent, ethical, independent decision maker. So that's the idea behind the rule of law. And this is the way the rule of law has been defined and articulated by the World Justice Project. It's quite consistent with also definitions that have been promoted by the Federal Judicial Center of the US government or by the United Nations. So there's a fair amount of consensus that is emerging around these concepts. That being said, there is in the popular media an enormous amount of confusion about the rule of law and what it means and what it doesn't mean. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you like.
Well, and one of the things you mentioned there, and you got the universal principles, but in your preamble, as you mentioned, you talked about how it has to be durable. So it's just not a one-time thing, obviously.
Absolutely. It's really, we like to think of it as a foundation for just communities. And a foundation, just like a foundation of a house, you want it to be sturdy and not have cracks in it. And it needs to be tended to. And that's what we very much see with the rule of law.
Again, we talk about those universal principles and that you've come up with the accountability and the just law and the open government and accessible and impartial. All of those, well, like for example, you talk about the justice, the accessible and impartial justice. That's the court system. But this rule of law is not just the court system.
Not at all. No. In fact, you go to the courts often when the rule of law is broken down, and that's kind of the last step in the process. But one of my favorite parts of this definition that I often lean into and really ask people to focus on is in that preamble where we talk about laws, institutions, norms. Okay, that's pretty much what people think of when they think about rule of law. But there's another important piece, which is community commitment.
Okay.
And that's critically important because most laws are implemented and abided by, not just by people who are complying voluntarily. If you don't have, you're in law enforcement, David, so you can't be prosecuting everyone. You
right.
have it has to be, the rule of law really relies on people complying voluntarily. And they do that when they have confidence that the system is fair.
True. And so that's, as you mentioned, that's one of the things that you're focusing on, at least just for your own personal life experience of what's important is to have that commitment into this area.
Absolutely.
And clearly you have that commitment yourself.
Yeah, I guess I've seen, as I said at the outset, I've seen what happens to societies when it breaks down, and it's really not something that anyone wants to see. And so I think it's really important that we tend to the rule of law, and it's also something that needs to be tended to constantly. We can't take it for granted. And it's not just for judges and lawyers to tend to. It's really for kind of a whole of society effort that needs to be undertaken to strengthen this social contract, essentially, that we have.
Well, and we've talked about what it is, and you've sort of mentioned it's important, but why does it matter? How's that for a big open broad brush question there for you?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. One of the benefits of WJP's work to measure the rule of law is that we've now developed this metric, the index, which measures the rule of law in 140 countries. We've got a huge data set on the rule of law and where it's adhered to and where it's not. And that allows us to then put that data together with other data about things like GDP, economic development, wealth of societies, with peace indices, with health metrics. And in each of these cases, we find a pretty compelling correlation between rule of law and all of these other good outcomes. More rule of law, more wealth for society. More rule of law, more health, lower infant mortality. More rule of law, higher achievement of education. More rule of law, more peace in society. And so that is, leaning into the data really makes a powerful evidence case for investing in this foundation to our societies. And it's intuitive. You know, when you're in a community that has rule of law,
Sure.
and you feel safe there, you feel opportunity there. You know, if something goes wrong, that you'll be able to get a fair shake and resolve that problem in a peaceful and amicable way. And that is really an incredibly valuable thing for any community.
It's sort of simplistic. Well, not sort of, it is simplistic, but in some ways you can almost say if people are being treated fairly, then they probably have at least a good start at the rule of law.
I often, if I'm forced to come up with a one-word definition for the rule of law, I use fairness.
So you've mentioned a couple of times here that this index, the rule of law index that the Justice Project has created and worked on and developed. How did that start, and what in general? You mentioned 140 countries. What is it?
Sure. So it's a quantitative measure of the rule of law. So we started with that definition that I described of the rule of law, and then we developed it further into what are the different factors that make up, that deliver that outcome. And we came up with this mechanism for measuring the rule of law on 8 different factors. And they are constraints on government powers. So that's all the checks and balances that we learned about in civics back in the day.
Yep.
It's the checks on the executive authority by the legislature, by the courts, by the media, and so on. That's factor 1. Factor 2 is absence of corruption. Do you have to pay a bribe every time you're stopped by the police, kind of a thing? Factor 3 is open government, whether there is access to information, government is accountable in an open and transparent way. Factor 4 is fundamental rights, things like freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression, absence of discrimination. That's our factor 4. And those first 4 factors are really all about the constraints on the government. What are the things the government can't do to all of us, right?
Okay.
And then the other 4 factors, or eight in total, are really factors that go to the duties of the government to the citizens. So it's order and security. The government has an obligation to maintain peace and security in the community. There is regulatory enforcement. How does the government regulate the society and do so efficiently and effectively? Third is civil justice. When you have civil disputes and you go to court, how do those get resolved? And are the courts independent in doing so? And finally, criminal justice. So those are our 8 factors. We then broke those down even further into sub-factors, and we developed a methodology that uses surveys. because we were interested in knowing not just what are the laws on the books, but how are they being implemented? How are they playing out in people's lives? What are the outcomes? So, and the best way to do that is to ask people. So we undertake surveys in every country, now 140 countries worldwide, of the general population in a representative sample, typically 1,000 households in each jurisdiction that is representative demographically of that jurisdiction. And then we also do surveys of practitioners. So if you've got lawyers in your audience, I'm going to make a pitch for them to become survey respondents, because we're quite interested in knowing how the rule of law is playing out in citizens' lives. But there's some things that the ordinary citizen, unless you have a huge sample size, we may not get enough people who've been to court in a given year to know how the courts are functioning. But we can ask lawyers that, and we can get good information about how the courts are functioning. So we ask a set of questions, and they're all on our website. Folks can go and look at those and think about the questions. We ask those questions, both of the general population and of lawyers, about how the system is working in practice. Have you been solicited for a bribe in the last year? Have you had any interactions with the police? And tell us about that.
Sure.
And what if a high-ranking official in your locality commits a crime, will they be held accountable? Questions like that. All the answers are then scored numerically. They're multiple choice questions so that we can score them and aggregate the scores and average them. And then we come up with scores on each of the factors and sub-factors, and then overall in a way that is comparable. So we can compare the United States to Canada to Mexico to Singapore and so on. And that's quite interesting and you can compare overall and also by factor and sub-factor. And when you break it down like that, that's quite interesting, because every country has strengths and weaknesses. And it's really healthy to acknowledge that and get past thinking that you have the rule of law here and you don't have it there. We all have work to do. And then we can roll up our sleeves and work on the issues that remain.
So, you said, how long has this index been working so far?
We've been doing the index for about a dozen years, but in the early years, it was really just a pilot exercise in a handful of countries, and we were testing out the different questionnaires to make sure that our methodology was generating good information. But since 2015, we have been doing it every year in exactly the same way. So we now have a longitudinal base of evidence. We can say over 5-6 years, here's what's happening in each country and across the globe. And we've been adding countries every year. And so we've worked our way up now to having, in 2022, our next index will be released on October 26th. We have 140 countries in the index.
So just as a general overview, are you seeing changes to the benefit or to the good of the rule of law in your index as far as broad brush type again?
Yeah, unfortunately, we are not. I mean, there are some countries that have been improving, but the big picture is that globally, for now 4 years, in 2021, and it was 4 years hand running, that more countries had declined in our index than had improved, including in the United States. So that's a very worrisome trend. And I'll say, in particular, the pandemic year was a bad one for the rule of law.
Yeah.
So we had seen a steady decline, more countries declining than improving every year since 2016. But between 2020 and 2021, we kind of went off the cliff. 74% of countries saw their rule of law index decline in that pandemic year.
Wow.
So that was, and some of it you can understand, because some of the things we measure were affected by the pandemic. Freedom of assembly. We couldn't gather in big crowds during the pandemic. And so that had an impact. And the timeliness of justice. 94% of countries had deterioration in the timeliness of justice during the pandemic. So that doesn't worry us so much because we think, oh, we'll rebound on those once things get back to normal. However, there were other things that happened quite precipitously in that pandemic year: increases in discrimination, and continuing declines in constraints on government powers that suggest that perhaps there was, at least in some countries, an abuse of the emergency powers that governments took during the pandemic. So we're very eager to see the new data on the 26th of October and see what has happened as we recover from the pandemic, what's rebounding, what's not, and what do we still have to work on.
And as you said, this comes out every year. So this the date you've mentioned a couple of times here, October 26th is the big date for the release of this year of 2022. And then you'll have a comparison of the previous years. And we still have, of course, the huge issue of the COVID and what's been going on and the disease and how it's impacting life everywhere. Are you hopeful that or optimistic at least there'll be some improvement from the pandemic years?
I do think there should be. I don't know yet, and I'm not going to betray the new data that's coming out. But
Darn, I thought I might get something out of you there.
but certainly on issues like the timeliness of justice.
Sure.
That courts have figured out how to function in this context and are really catching back up on backlogs, and we should. I don't think we'll see a continuing deterioration there, and we should see some rebound. But I'm quite concerned about some of the other trends that, as I said, predated the pandemic and may well continue in this year.
Well, as an aside, one of the things you mentioned about the courts, as we've mentioned, I'm a prosecutor, and during the pandemic, especially the several months, the Michigan Supreme Court closed down the courthouses basically, and no jury trials were held. And we were trying to do some work from home, and as a prosecutor, that's not the way we do it, obviously. So, as you say, that's impacted everywhere. But I know at least here we're back and going at things, but hopefully that's true with more places as well. So you have the indexed. And you mentioned at the beginning here a little bit of the other things that the World Justice Project does of engagement and research and scholarship. What do you see there as far as the things that how your organization can make an impact on the rule of law?
Yeah. Well, it starts with information and data. We think it's really important to bring that evidence base to bear. We have lots of ideas about government, and it can be quite helpful to have this evidence base that is very rigorously gathered and can maybe set the table for a constructive conversation about the situation, as opposed to just having people's opinions or impressions about issues of government. So bringing that data to bear is very helpful. It also helps us measure progress over time. And we have seen as our data is increasingly used by a large variety of actors, international organizations, investors, multinational corporations use it to evaluate risk, that is quite motivating for governments who want to perhaps attract that investment to shape up. And so that's a really powerful dynamic to see unfold. So that's an important contribution. But then, of course, there are lots of questions about, so once people are convinced we need the rule of law, then how do you get it? And that's an even harder question to answer. And we work with partners around the world to identify best practices and to promote those innovations that have been proven to strengthen the rule of law in different contexts, and to share that information. Now, we are very eager to emphasize that there's no one size fits all or cookie cutter approach to this. Each jurisdiction needs to design their systems of government that work in that context. But there are certain elements and strategies, approaches that have been tried and proven in one context and can be used in another. We run a global competition called the World Justice Challenge,
Okay.
through which we try to crowdsource some of that innovation and then profile the organizations and institutions that are doing that kind of innovating and encourage others to follow suit. So those are some of the contributions that we are making in this field.
You mentioned the competition there, and I know I've seen on your website there some looks like I won't say award winners, but indicate individuals that you recognize for the work they're doing, wherever that may be, in whatever part of the country that might be. It was fascinating to read some of the descriptions that the work that they're achieving.
Yeah, no, it's we have a big global conference every 2 years, our World Justice Forum, and there's information about it on the web. You can watch all the video, and it's almost like being there. We just had one in June, our World Justice Forum, and the competition took place there, and folks came from all over the world to share their strategies for strengthening the rule of law. And it was truly inspiring sometimes against incredible odds, to hear about the difference that people were making in their communities. And then to see people across jurisdictions, connecting the dots and between their different approaches and learning from one another and sharing strategies is truly exciting.
Well, one of the things that this made me think of, I guess, is you talked about these individuals, recognizing them, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it's possible for one person to make a difference, that they can educate someone else, they can bring someone else, and they can expand that effort that they're doing. But it starts with one person really saying enough's enough. Is that a fair statement?
It is. It's actually something that I've been doing a lot of thinking about and some writing about lately, is the importance of rule of law leadership. And the laws and the institutions and, a good constitution. We just had Constitution Day here in the United States. And that's all really important. But the implementation of those laws often boils down to people and individuals who take decisions of integrity and honesty and fairness. And sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes it's personally compromising for them to do that, but they stand up for the principle, and that's really admirable.
So we've talked about some of the exciting things that are coming up, and I don't know how far you want to go in this part, this question here, but there's obviously, we've talked about the global effort here and the work that you're trying to achieve. Are there certain areas or certain places where one that you've had to do an emphasis that you're more concerning sometimes, and really it's a struggle, I guess is the best way of saying it?
Well, we have a number of priority countries where we are focusing our efforts. The United States is one of them, because it's one that has been historically really a beacon for the rule of law, but it is also one of the countries in our index where for 5 years we've seen that consistent deterioration, and that's very concerning.
Sure.
And that compounds with some areas of long-standing weakness in the rule of law in the United States, particularly in the administration of justice. Discrimination in our justice system is a real weakness and an area of concern. So we have actually just recently launched a 3-year initiative to focus on the United States and raise awareness of the data in the United States, and to engage audience and actors on it, to try to promote effective responses to some of the trends that we see here in the U.S. We have also begun to do some subnational studies where we look at the rule of law, not at the national level, but at the local level, and essentially undertake the same exercise that we do country by country, but do it state by state or locality by locality. So we've had a big project now, several years hand running in Mexico, where we have measured the rule of law in all 32 states. of Mexico. It's a federal system, very much like the United States. And so a lot of the action on rule of law is at the state and local level. And that's been incredibly productive in terms of fostering conversations within Mexican society about the strengths and weaknesses, and being able to profile maybe one state that is stronger in one area and another that's weaker, and what can they learn from one another. So we're about to undertake a similar exercise in the European Union, where in all of the member states of the European Union, we're going to be gathering data on the rule of law at the subnational level, so that we can see what's happening locally, not just nationally or supranationally. So those are some geographies that are areas of focus for us. We recently published a series of studies on rule of law in Central America. We were interested in what were the rule of law factors that might be driving migration. And some quite interesting data emerged from those studies, and those reports are on our website and are quite helpful in thinking of, in informing the migration debate. However you feel about more or less migration, if you can focus on some of these root causes and the suffering that lies behind them, that would be beneficial for everyone.
Agreed on that. And you mentioned you have offices in DC and Seattle, Mexico City, and Singapore.
Yes.
So you're definitely trying to get around the globe there and get a wide variety of information and message out there, sounds like.
Yes, exactly. Our Singapore office is a regional Asia Pacific office, and that's another area of focus. We have a new Asia Pacific strategy that we're launching in a stakeholder meeting in Jakarta in December, and that will focus on a number of areas of concern in that region that have emerged in our work, on judicial independence, on how to deal with fake news. There have been a number of countries in the region that have adopted laws on fake news that are in some cases excessive and curtailing freedom of expression. So yeah, that's a really challenging rule of law issue, to regulate fake news, but not do so in a way that curbs expression. So we're going to work on that, on access to justice, and importantly, in engaging the private sector and as stakeholders in all of this. So that's to come in Asia.
It sounds like you're not going to be working yourself out of a job anytime soon here.
Unfortunately, the rule of law these days is a bit of a growth business, but I remain optimistic that we can find willing partners and effective approaches to advancing the rule of law, and we find them in every country, and it's inspiring to hear about the work that they're doing and to find ways to support them.
Oh, I don't doubt that part about it being inspiring. But clearly we have a ways to go on all of this effort. If someone's out there listening right now to this episode, where can they go to get more information about the World Justice Project, about the index, the papers you mentioned? Where do they go?
Sure. So they should go to our website, worldjusticeproject.org. They can also follow us on social media. We're on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn, whatever your favorite platform is, we're there, and happy to connect with folks there. Those who are legal practitioners can inquire about answering our surveys. We're always looking to increase the sample size of our surveys of legal practitioners in every jurisdiction. So you can send an email to wjp@worldjusticeproject.org to inquire about that. And you can get information, you can subscribe to our newsletter and come to our events either in person or online, and we'd be happy to make you part of our rule of law movement.
Well, Betsy, I want to thank you so much. And I will say too that I will have those links in the show notes on the Justice Speakers Institute website as well, so that they can get either way to make sure that they get to your website to get that information and that message. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about the October 26th release and the index that comes out there at that time. But as I say, I just want to thank you for taking your time in your busy schedule to chat with us a little bit and share your message. And Hopefully we can keep the conversation going across the globe on the rule of law and its importance, and the effort that you're doing to at least make somewhat of a difference there and get things going in the right direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. My pleasure.
The Justice Speaks podcast is brought to you by the Justice Speakers Institute, LLC, the premier international speakers bureau on justice issues. This podcast is to give you the knowledge and be able to ask the questions on creating justice in your community.